On the morning of my 77th birthday, I told myself not to expect much. My husband was long gone, my phone had been silent since yesterday, and even the mailbox didn't offer a card. But then Daniel called, my oldest son. He said he hadn't forgotten, that he was taking me out for lunch, just the two of us, like we used to when he was little and still needed me. For a moment I believed him. I ironed my best blouse, brushed my hair twice. I even lit the good candle in the hallway. But what I didn't know then was that this birthday wasn't a celebration. It was a carefully planned erasure. And I was the only one who hadn't been told. I touched the picture frame, gently tracing the edge of his jaw with my fingertip. 7, Richard. I whispered. You'd laugh and say I don't look a day over 55. The kitchen clock ticked louder than usual, reminding me that birthdays once filled with laughter and cakes had turned into days of reflection and silence. My 3 children were scattered in different worlds now. Daniel, my eldest, was 52 and drowning in failed business ventures. Once ambitious and charming, he had hardened over the years, his smile never quite reaching his eyes anymore. Laura, my only daughter, was 50 and worked at a bank. Practical sharp, but her calls had grown fewer and shorter, her tone more obligatory than affectionate. And then there was Michael, my youngest, at 45, living in San Francisco with his own family and career in software. He was the one who called on holidays and always tried to make me laugh, though the miles between us stretched like an ocean. I could not deny the ache of being set aside. There had been Christmases where I was left with only a card, birthdays where my phone never rang. Yet even as I braced myself for another day of solitude, a part of me still hoped for a knock at the door, a surprise, some reminder that I mattered to them. The phone rang just as I was rinsing my coffee cup. My heart skipped. Birthdays had a way of making you hopeful, even against your better judgment. I picked up, steadying my voice. Hello? Happy birthday, Mom? The voice was Daniel's. My chest tightened. His tone was smoother than I expected, even warm. Daniel, I said softly, cautious. Thank you. I was thinking, he continued, maybe we could do lunch today. Just the two of us. I'll come by in about an hour and pick you up. There's a place I want to take you. I pressed the receiver tighter against my ear. Daniel hadn't asked me to lunch in years. My first instinct was suspicion. What did he want? But almost immediately another feeling rose up, fragile and dangerous hope. Lunch. I repeated, my voice trembling slightly. Yeah, he said with a short laugh. Don't sound so surprised. It's your birthday. Let me do this for you. For a moment I closed my eyes. I remembered him as a boy running into the kitchen with a hand-picked bouquet of dandelions, declaring me the best mom in the world. That memory clashed with the man on the phone, now a man whose eyes had grown cold, who rarely called unless there was something at stake. Still, I wanted, so badly, to believe in that little boy again. That would be nice. Daniel, I answered finally. I'll be ready. Great. See you soon, Mom. He hung up before I could ask anything more. I set the phone down slowly, my hand lingering on the counter. I felt the familiar tug-of-war inside me. Caution pulling one way, longing pulling the other. Richard had always warned me about ignoring my instincts. Yet today I wanted to silence that little voice that told me something was off. I straightened my back, walked into the bedroom, and opened my closet. My hands brushed past sweaters and old dresses until they stopped on the navy blue dress Richard had always loved, the one I'd worn to our anniversary dinner years ago. I slipped it on, smoothed the fabric over my hips, and for a brief moment I felt younger, steadier. As I stood in front of the mirror, I studied the lines on my face, the years etched into my skin. My eyes still held the same fire, though. That fire told me to be careful, to be alert. But another part of me, perhaps the softer, lonelier part, was whispering, Maybe this is Daniel reaching out. Maybe this is a chance. I put on a strand of pearls, dabbed a bit of perfume, and sat back down at the kitchen table. The clock hands crept toward noon. Outside, the late winter air hung gray and heavy bare trees swaying in the breeze. My heart thudded in my chest, not just from anticipation, but from a gnawing question that I couldn't shake. Why now? I didn't have the answer. All I knew was that in a few minutes Daniel would pull into the driveway and my birthday would take a turn I couldn't yet see. I folded my hands on the table, breathed in deeply, and waited for the sound of his car. The sound of tires on gravel made me turn toward the window. A sleek black SUV eased into the driveway, cleaner and newer than any car I'd ever seen Daniel drive. I stood slowly, brushing invisible lint from my dress, and walked to the door, trying to calm the flutter in my chest. Daniel stepped out wearing a dark coat and polished shoes. His hair slicked back in a way that reminded me more of a salesman than my son. He gave me a brief smile, tight-lipped. "Happy birthday, Mom," he said, giving me a quick hug that felt more formal than familiar. "Thank you, Daniel," I replied, studying his face. He looked tired beneath the polished exterior. "Ready for lunch?" he asked, gesturing toward the SUV. I nodded, clutching my purse a little tighter. "Is Monica not coming?" He waved the question off. She had errands. Thought it'd be nice just the two of us. There was something in the way he said it, almost too rehearsed. I didn't press further. I followed him to the car and stepped in, sinking into the plush leather seat that smelled faintly of a dealership showroom. The engine purred as he pulled out of the driveway. We drove in silence for the first few blocks past familiar streets, where I used to walk the kids to school, past the bakery that had closed years ago. The city looked the same, but the stillness between us felt unfamiliar. "So, how have you been feeling lately?" Daniel asked suddenly, eyes on the road. I turned toward him. "Still sharp enough to beat the newspaper crossword before noon, if that's what you're asking." He gave a short laugh. "I meant physically. Your knees holding up?" "You still managing the stairs all right?" "I get up and down just fine," I said, my tone edging firmer. "Still mow my own lawn. Not that anyone's asked in a while." He nodded slowly, tapping the steering wheel. "I just worry about you in that big old house, that's all." There it was, the same line I'd heard from Laura last Thanksgiving. I didn't respond. Daniel cleared his throat. "Have you thought more about downsizing?" "Could be nice to have a place with less maintenance. I've lived in that house for over 40 years, I said. It's not the maintenance that's the issue. It's the people who stop visiting." His jaw tightened, but he didn't reply. We merged onto the highway, heading north. I frowned. "Where are we going?" I asked. "I thought we were staying in the city." "Oh," he said, feigning nonchalance. "There's a new place just past Cranberry. Quiet, upscale, good reviews. Figured you'd like something different." I stared out the window as the skyline shrank behind us. The route felt deliberate, strategic. Something didn't sit right. My thoughts drifted to an odd encounter a few weeks ago. Someone had knocked on my door, a well-dressed woman holding a clipboard asking if I might be interested in selling. She claimed to be a local agent but couldn't name a single neighbor. When I declined, she left quickly. I'd felt uneasy since, especially after finding Daniel's name on a sticky note under the phone she'd left behind. I shifted in my seat. "So, what's the name of this place?" He hesitated. "You'll see when we get there. It's kind of a surprise." His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. I forced a small laugh. "You're not kidnapping your old mother, are you?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't be dramatic." The highway stretched ahead, lined with gray trees and the occasional truck roaring past. I glanced at the GPS on the dash. The destination wasn't programmed in. "Daniel," I said slowly, "are we still going to lunch?" "Of course," he replied too quickly. "It's just a little further than usual." The air in the SUV suddenly felt heavier. I adjusted my seatbelt and pressed my palms against my knees to keep them from trembling. I reached into my purse, pretending to look for a tissue. My fingers closed around my phone. I slipped it out, keeping it low, and quickly tapped the message I'd pre-written the night before. One word. All caps. Now I hit send to Thomas Green and slid the phone back into my bag. My heart pounded louder than the engine. Daniel didn't notice. He was humming now some old tune from a commercial. I watched the trees blur past and wondered if Richard would be proud of how calm I was staying. The exit signs began to change. Wexford, Marshall, Bradford, Woods. We were nowhere near any restaurant I recognized. I stared straight ahead, my voice calm when I spoke again. Daniel, why don't we just stop for coffee first? I saw a diner a few miles back. He shook his head. We've got a reservation. Can't be late. I said nothing more. But inside I knew. We weren't going to lunch. We were going somewhere I hadn't agreed to go. And whatever was waiting at the end of that road. Daniel had planned it long before today. Where exactly are we going? Daniel, I asked, not bothering to mask the edge in my voice. He didn't answer right away. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, knuckles pale against the leather. We passed a sign for Harmony Junction, 22 miles from home. It's just a place, he finally said, eyes fixed on the road. A nice one. Peaceful. You'll see. That's not an answer. He exhaled through his nose, long and slow, like I'd asked something unreasonable. It's a place where you'll be taken care of, where you won't have to worry about stairs or grocery shopping or being alone. I stared at him. A nursing home. Not a nursing home, he said quickly. An assisted living community, very modern. They have chefs, art classes, private suites. You've already visited it. He didn't respond. You've toured it, haven't you? I pressed, signed something. Put a deposit down. Mom, don't... I sat back, heart thudding. The road ahead blurred for a moment, and I closed my eyes. I didn't ask for this, Daniel. He shifted in his seat. You didn't have to. Everyone's been talking about it. Laura thinks it's for the best. Even Monica agrees. Of course Laura agreed. And Monica, I was sure she'd be thrilled to have me out of the picture. You should have talked to me first. I knew you'd react like this, he muttered. I glanced out the window. Fields stretched out in every direction. No restaurants, no shops. Just trees and quiet roads. You planned this, I whispered. This wasn't about lunch. This was never about lunch. He didn't deny it. The betrayal hit me like a cold wind down my spine. You think I'm senile? I asked. No, he said too quickly. Not senile, just forgetful. Slower. It's nothing to be ashamed of. People your age... Don't finish that sentence. He shut his mouth. The SUV felt like a moving cell, each mile a nail in the coffin of my independence. My fingers drifted back to my purse. I'd already sent the message, but I kept the phone near just in case. I looked at Daniel. My son, my firstborn, the boy who used to draw stick figures of our family in crayon and hand them to me with pride. The same boy who once cried when I scraped my knee gardening. That boy had disappeared, replaced by this man with a leather watch and cold intentions. I trusted you. I said more to myself than to him. I'm doing this for you, he snapped. You don't see it now, but you will. I swallowed the lump in my throat. You're doing this for yourself, for your convenience. You're justifying it with brochures and buzzwords. His jaw clenched and he tapped the steering wheel again, that same nervous rhythm from before. Sunset Haven is one of the top-rated facilities in the state, he said almost to himself. My stomach dropped. He hadn't meant to say it. I turned slowly. What did you say? He blinked. What you said, Sunset Haven. His lips parted, then closed again. That's the name of the place, isn't it? He sighed. It's not what you think. I think you were going to drop me off like some forgotten package and drive away. He rubbed his temple. Don't be dramatic. No, let's be clear. I leaned toward him, voice steady. You made arrangements. Without telling me. Without asking. On my birthday. He didn't speak. And in that silence, something inside me hardened. Not anger, not fear, something sharper. Resolve. I looked down at my lap and folded my hands together to keep them from shaking. The road signs began to change again, and I knew we were getting close. But now I wasn't helpless. I wasn't unaware. And I sure as hell wasn't done. I stared out the window as fields rolled by, patches of frost clinging to the dead grass, and my mind drifted, not forward but backward, into the quiet, unspoken spaces of the last 10 years. It hadn't happened all at once, the distance. It came like water under a door, slow and subtle, until I woke up one day and realized my family had closed me out without even slamming it. Daniel and Monica were the first to pull away, though at the time I didn't see it clearly. It started with missed calls, excuses about the kids' schedules, work being hectic. Then came the forgotten birthdays, the invitations that never arrived. One Christmas, I sat at the table with a pot roast and cranberry sauce for 6, only to receive a text an hour after dinner time. "Sorry, Mom, we got caught up at Monica's folks' place." I remembered standing at the window that night, still in my red cardigan, watching the snow fall, and trying to convince myself it wasn't personal. But it was. It always had been. Then there was Laura. Always the professional one, efficient and polished, but emotionally absent. She called when she needed something help with a down payment, co-signing a loan when her credit dipped after the divorce. But when I'd ask her to stop by or join me for church on Easter, there was always a luncheon or a meeting a client she couldn't reschedule. I used to babysit her daughter Riley every Tuesday when she was little. We made macaroni crafts and watched cooking shows. But somewhere around Riley's 8th birthday, the Tuesdays stopped. No explanation. Just silence. Michael was different. He never promised more than he could give. His calls came like clockwork on Sundays, even when he was buried in deadlines. He once flew across the country for my gallbladder surgery, sitting beside my hospital bed with takeout noodles and crossword puzzles. Still, he had his life in San Francisco. His wife, his little boy, his work, and I never asked him to shoulder what his siblings wouldn't. But the one that hurt most deeply, strangely enough, was Maria. She used to come over after school back when she was 13 and full of questions about everything: how to sew on a button, what my wedding dress looked like, what my favorite book was as a girl. She'd sit on my couch legs tucked under her eating cookies and telling me about her teachers and her dream of opening an animal rescue someday. I had believed we were close, until she vanished. No goodbye, no explanation. Just stopped coming, stopped calling. I told myself she was growing up busy with high school with college prep, but the silence stretched too long. I sent birthday cards that were never acknowledged, left voicemails that were never returned. It wasn't until last year that I learned from a neighbor that Maria had been accepted into Boston University. My own granddaughter, a bright, ambitious young woman, and I hadn't even known. That night I sat in the dark holding her childhood drawing of the two of us, her tiny hand in mine, stick figures with flowers in our hair, and felt something splinter quietly inside. It was only much later in pieces that I realized Daniel had been the architect of the silence. He'd told her I was forgetful, that I was depressed, that I didn't want company. He'd framed me as a burden before I even had a chance to become one. And she had believed him. Maybe I couldn't blame her. I didn't have social media. I didn't text like the younger ones did. All she knew was what her father told her, and if that was all she had, of course she drifted. But that didn't make it easier. That didn't make it right. As the SUV hummed along the road, I clenched my hands in my lap, staring at my reflection in the glass. I looked old in that moment. Not in the way time makes you old, but in the way abandonment carves deep lines where love should have been. I thought of the neighbors down the block. Mrs. Robbins, who fell and was found 2 days later. Mr. Harlan, whose kids visited once a year and let the nursing home handle everything else. Quiet disappearances like lights going out one by one. No funerals, no memorials, just silence. If I hadn't prepared, if I hadn't listened to that small, stubborn voice in me, I could have become one of them. A file in a drawer, a bed in a hallway, a woman who used to be someone's mother, and no one would have known, no one would have asked. The thought chilled me deeper than the cold wind outside. Daniel adjusted the air vent, oblivious. He glanced at his watch, then back to the road. I didn't speak. Not yet. Not until I knew someone, anyone, was still listening. We'd been on the road for over an hour, and the signs for Sunset Haven had started appearing on roadside billboards. Pastel-colored ads showing smiling seniors doing yoga, painting, drinking lemonade in tidy courtyards. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, watching each one pass like a countdown. Daniel hadn't spoken much since our last exchange. He kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the gear shift, eyes fixed forward with a kind of forced calmness that told me he was rehearsing his next move. I didn't need to ask what he was thinking. I already knew. Then his phone buzzed in the center console. He glanced down, and for a split second I saw it. Sunset Haven. Incoming call. I turned my head toward him, keeping my tone light. "Is that Percy calling you?" I asked sweetly. He stiffened. "What Percy?" I said again, feigning confusion. "The dog you had in college. I thought I saw his name pop up." His eyes darted toward me, uncertain. "No. Just junk call." I said, turning my face back to the window. "Strange name for spam." He silenced the phone without answering. The tension in the car sharpened like a blade. His fingers began tapping the steering wheel again, the same nervous rhythm I'd noticed earlier. The silence between us stretched long and taut. Then, flashing blue lights. I blinked. A cruiser in the rearview mirror had its siren on lights pulsing in rhythm. Daniel swore under his breath and pulled onto the shoulder tires, crunching over gravel. "What the hell?" he muttered, reaching for his wallet. I wasn't even speeding. My pulse quickened, but I kept my face neutral. I didn't want him to know I'd planned any of this, that I'd known exactly how long it would take. The officer approached the driver's side, a tall man with calm eyes and a hand resting on his belt. He leaned down, peering through the open window. "Good afternoon," he said. "I'm Trooper Ryan Cole with Pennsylvania State Police. License and registration, please." Daniel forced a smile. "Sure, officer. Just taking my mother to lunch?" Trooper Cole's eyes slid to me. "Ma'am, are you Evelyn Parker?" I met his gaze steadily. "I am." He gave a small nod. "Your attorney contacted our office. He was concerned for your safety." Daniel let out a tight laugh. "What? No, that's a misunderstanding. My mom's been confused lately. We're just going to visit a care facility. She needs help and we're trying to do what's best." "I'm not confused," I said loudly enough to cut him off. "And I never agreed to visit Sunset Haven." Trooper Cole's expression didn't change, but I could see his posture shift. He stood straighter, more alert. He turned back to Daniel. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Daniel looked at me, then back to the officer. "This is insane. She's my mother. We're just talking." "Now, sir," Trooper Cole repeated firmly. Daniel opened the door and stepped out, muttering to himself. I couldn't hear what he said, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the frantic glance he gave toward the phone still sitting in the console. Trooper Cole circled around to my side and opened the door. "Ma'am, are you able to walk?" "Yes," I said. My legs were shaky, but not from age. From adrenaline, from fury I was forcing down. He offered his hand, but I waved it off and stepped out on my own. The cold air hit me like a splash of water. Another officer had pulled up behind, stepping out and speaking quietly with Daniel, who was gesturing wildly now, trying to look in control. It wasn't working. Trooper Cole led me toward his vehicle. "You're safe now, ma'am. We've contacted Mr. Green. He's on his way to meet you." I exhaled slowly. For the first time in hours, my breath didn't catch in my throat. "You did everything right," he added. "The message reached the legal office 23 minutes after you sent it." They acted fast. I nodded, swallowing the swell of emotion in my chest. Across the road, Daniel stood with his arms crossed, pacing beside the car. He looked smaller now, no longer in control, no longer the man behind the wheel, just a grown child caught in his own deception. I turned away from him and looked at the trees lining the highway, tall and bare against the sky. It wasn't over. But the road he thought he'd chosen for me, it had just ended. Daniel stood a few yards away, arms crossed, voice rising just enough for me to hear. "This is ridiculous. My mother needs help. She's not well. She forgets things, she talks to herself." I didn't look at him. I was seated in the back of the cruiser now, not under arrest, not detained, just waiting for the man I had called weeks ago when my instincts first whispered that something wasn't right. The second state trooper, a younger man named Patel, watched Daniel carefully. "Sir, we've spoken with your mother. She's coherent, articulate, and appears mentally sound. She's good at hiding it," Daniel insisted. "You don't know what it's like day to day." I opened the door and stepped out, slow but steady. "Daniel," I said evenly, "stop lying." He turned to me, jaw tightening. "I'm not lying. I'm trying to protect you." I raised my chin. By driving me to a facility I never agreed to visit on my birthday without telling me, Trooper Cole looked between us, eyes sharp. Just then, a silver Toyota pulled up behind the cruisers. A tall man in a dark trench coat stepped out, briefcase in hand. Thomas Green. He walked with purpose, the cold wind catching the edge of his coat. "Ms. Parker," he greeted me with a nod, then turned to the officers. "I'm Thomas Green, her legal counsel. Thank you for your swift response." Trooper Cole offered a handshake. "We're just making sure everything stays safe and legal." Green turned to Daniel, voice calm but firm. "Mr. Parker, I've brought your mother's recent medical documentation, all signed by her physician 2 weeks ago. Full cognitive function. No signs of impairment." He handed a folder to Trooper Cole, who began flipping through it. "I've also submitted copies of communications between you and a representative from Sunset Haven Green continued, emails, call logs, and the intake form you filled out under your mother's name without her consent." Daniel's face drained of color. I didn't sign anything," he stammered. "No," Green said, "but you tried. And intent is what matters here." Daniel took a step back. "She's exaggerating. This is all being twisted." Green didn't flinch. "You also accessed your mother's GPS location through her phone plan and monitored her movements over the past 3 months. That's already been flagged in our initial report." Patel raised his eyebrows. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. I stepped forward. My voice was calm. "They told me I was paranoid, that I was imagining things. But I've been documenting everything, every missed call, every strange knock at the door, every time you asked about my finances instead of my health." Trooper Cole looked at Green. "What's the next step?" "We're submitting all of this to the district attorney's office," Green replied. "They'll determine if charges under the elder abuse and exploitation statutes are warranted. We're not pressing for immediate arrest. We're pursuing due process." Daniel let out a short laugh, bitter and cornered. "This is insane. You're treating me like some criminal for trying to help my own mother." I met his eyes. "You weren't helping me, Daniel. You were trying to erase me, quietly and efficiently." His shoulders sagged, the facade slipping away in slow pieces. "You don't understand what it's been like. Monica lost her job. We're underwater on the house. The taxes are killing us. And that justifies taking mine," I asked. "Justifies locking me up somewhere far enough that no one asks questions." He didn't answer. Green stepped between us slightly. "This isn't a negotiation, Mr. Parker." "You've crossed a line, and there are legal consequences for that." The wind picked up again. I wrapped my coat tighter around me. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving a raw ache behind my ribs. But I stood tall. Because now he knew. He knew I wasn't the frail, forgetful woman he thought he could manipulate. And this time he was the one caught unprepared. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the same spot where I'd waited for Daniel that morning. A cup of chamomile tea sat untouched beside me, steam curling into the quiet air. My laptop was open, the cursor blinking in the subject line of a new email. I stared at it for a long time before typing. Subject: What happened on my 77th birthday? I took a deep breath and let my fingers move. The words came slowly at first, then all at once. Steady, direct, without embellishment. I didn't write it to make anyone feel sorry for me. I wrote it so they would finally know the truth. I told them about the drive, about the lies, about how Daniel had tried to take me somewhere I never agreed to go. I explained how the police had intervened thanks to my attorney and how it wasn't the first time I'd suspected something was wrong. I named names. I gave dates. I didn't soften any of it. And then I wrote this: If you haven't heard from me in years, it's not because I didn't want to see you. It's because someone made sure I couldn't. When I finished, I read it once, then twice. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. I hit send, not just to Daniel and Laura and Michael, but to Monica, to Maria, to cousins in Illinois, friends from church, my old neighbor Carol, even my bridge partner from the Y who had moved to Arizona, everyone who might have wondered where I'd gone. Then I closed the laptop and sat in silence. It took less than 5 minutes. The first email came from Diane, my cousin in Ohio. What the hell, Evelyn? Are you okay? Do you want me to come? Then, from Judy, a longtime friend, I knew something felt off. I called years ago and Monica said you'd moved. Evelyn, I'm so sorry. More poured in. Dozens. Some were outraged, some apologetic, some short and horrified, some long and tearful, and then just as I reached for my tea, my phone buzzed. Maria. I hesitated before opening it. My hands trembled just slightly. The message read, Grandma, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I'm coming over tonight. I stared at the screen, my breath caught in my chest. Then another message. Please wait up for me. I set the phone down, folded my hands around the mug, and let the warmth sink in. Outside, the sky was dark and quiet. But inside, something was beginning to shift. Not anger, not revenge, just light, and the kind of truth that doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. It was nearly 1 a.m. when I heard the knock at the front door. Not loud, just 3 soft raps like someone trying not to wake the whole world. I opened it, and there she was. Maria. Her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail sweatshirt, wrinkled from hours behind the wheel. Eyes red but determined. She looked younger than I remembered and older at the same time. Before I could say a word, she threw her arms around me and held on tight. I'm so sorry, Grandma, she whispered. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I held her, feeling the wetness of her tears on my shoulder. It had been nearly 4 years since I'd last seen her in person. Well, she smelled like old road coffee and peppermint gum, and I didn't care. I would have stood there holding her all night. We sat in the living room, the lamp casting a soft glow over us. She pulled her legs up under her and looked at me with so much regret I had to look away. Dad told me you were confused, she said quietly. That you didn't want visitors. That you asked not to see anyone outside the family. I didn't answer right away. I just studied her face. The face I'd once kissed goodnight 100 times. I believed him, she added, and I didn't check for myself. That's not your fault, I said gently. When you're young, you believe what you're told. But I should have known better, she whispered. I should have called. I should have come. She wiped her face with her sleeve. I missed you so much, I said softly, but I always thought, when you were ready, you'd find your way back. She reached for my hand and held it tightly. The doorbell rang again. Maria looked up, startled. I stood, crossed the room, and opened the door. Laura. In a tailored coat hair perfectly in place despite the hour expression already taut with defense. Well, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, this blew up fast. She glanced toward Maria on the couch and gave a strained smile. Glad you could join us. Maria said nothing. Laura set her purse down on the entry table and turned to me. Look, I read the email, and the response is, it's a mess. But Daniel didn't mean harm Mom. He just thought you needed help. I stared at her. Help would have been asking me what I wanted. Laura exhaled. You know how proud you are. You never ask for anything. We all thought you might be slipping and we didn't want you to get hurt. I wasn't slipping, I said. You just stopped paying attention. She waved a hand. Let's not turn this into drama. What's done is done. Daniel made a mistake. No, Maria said suddenly. Her voice was sharp and clear. It wasn't a mistake. Laura blinked at her. Excuse me. Maria stood. Dad didn't make a mistake. He planned it. He tried to put Grandma away in a facility so he could access her accounts. That's not caretaking. That's manipulation. That's abuse. Laura's face tightened. Maria, you're overreacting. No, I'm not, Maria snapped. I saw the intake emails. I saw the documents he drafted. You think this is just some misunderstanding? Laura crossed her arms. We were trying to protect her, by isolating her, by lying to me for years. Maria stepped forward. You didn't protect her. You erased her. And you let Dad treat her like she was disposable. The room fell into a charged silence. Laura's jaw twitched. You don't understand how hard things have been. Monica lost her job. They were drowning. Maria shook her head. So they decided to sink someone else to save themselves. Laura glanced at me, then back at her daughter. We were just trying to make the best decision for everyone. No, Maria said. You were making the best decision for yourselves. I sat back down in the armchair watching the two of them, mother and daughter, standing in the same room, years of silence crashing into a single moment. Maria turned to me, tears brimming again. You deserved better, Grandma. I didn't speak, because sometimes the truth doesn't need repeating. It just needs to be heard. The doorbell rang again just after breakfast. This time it wasn't a surprise. I'd been expecting him. Thomas Green stood in the doorway in a dark suit holding a leather folder under one arm. He nodded to me, polite as ever, then stepped inside and removed his coat. Maria sat at the kitchen counter nursing a cup of coffee. Laura lingered by the window, arms folded, eyes still puffy from the argument the night before. The silence between them had thickened into something brittle and ready to crack. I thought it best to deliver this in person, Green said as he laid the folder down on the table. There are some updates you should all be aware of. I motioned for him to continue. He opened the folder and slid out a stack of printed emails. These are communications between your son, Daniel Parker, and an intake coordinator at Sunset Haven. The emails begin 6 weeks ago. The latest one was sent the morning of your birthday. Laura turned from the window, her arms slowly falling to her sides. Green flipped to the next page. There's also a signed pre-admission form submitted online listing your personal information and a note authorizing automatic payments from what appears to be your bank account. I kept my eyes on Laura. And finally he added, pulling out a slim receipt, a wire confirmation of a $5,000 deposit made to Sunset Haven. From Daniel's joint account with his wife Monica. Laura stepped forward, her voice small. $5,000, yes, Green said. Non-refundable unless medically disqualified. She stared at the paper like it had physically struck her. He never told me that. I said nothing. Some truths are louder in silence. Maria glanced over the documents and frowned. This was premeditated. Green nodded. There's also evidence Daniel contacted an elder care financial consultant about asset transfers. He inquired how to legally gain control over your accounts through a temporary guardianship filing. Laura looked at me, then her face pale. Mom, I didn't know it went this far. I swear. I believe you, I said quietly. But you helped him paint the picture. We all sat for a moment, the weight of it settling over us. Just then the front door creaked open. Hello, a voice called from the hallway. Mom. Michael! He stepped into the kitchen suitcase still in hand, coat unzipped, looking like he'd just come straight from the airport. He smiled when he saw me. "You okay? I am now," I said, standing to greet him. He hugged me tightly, then turned to Green. "I came as soon as I could. Caught the red eye from San Francisco." Maria beamed. Laura looked even smaller now, shrinking in the corner. "I got the email." Michael continued, his tone tightening. "I called Daniel." He hung up on me. "I'm not surprised," I said. "Well, he said, setting his bag down, you're not staying here alone anymore. I've cleared the guest house at our place. As soon as you're ready, you'll come stay with us. Claire's excited, and Max, he already set up a chair for you at his chessboard." I smiled. "That sounds peaceful." "I want you close," he said. "Where you're respected. Safe." I reached for the folder Green had left on the table. With calm hands, I pulled out a single document I'd kept separate. Not legal paperwork, not evidence. A bank statement. I laid it flat on the table. "I want you all to see something," I said. They leaned in. "This," I continued, tapping the page, "is my savings account. As of this month, it holds $1.2 million. This," I pointed to a second document, "is my long-term life insurance policy. $350,000. Richard set it up before he passed." Laura gasped. Maria stared. Michael said nothing, just nodded once. "I never told you," I said, "because I never owed anyone that explanation, and I wanted to live simply, quietly. But I want it to be known. Daniel didn't just try to control an old woman's care. He made a calculated bet that I had nothing left. I met Laura's eyes. He bet wrong. It was almost 9 p.m. when the knock came. I knew it would be him before I even opened the door. The weight behind that knock wasn't hesitation. It was shame. When I pulled the door open, Daniel was standing on the porch in the same wrinkled shirt he'd worn the day before. His eyes were swollen, his hair uncombed. And then he dropped to his knees. He didn't say anything at first, just stared up at me like a child who had finally realized he wasn't in control anymore. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Mom." I stood there unmoved. The wind was cold. The porch light flickered. For a moment, the whole world felt suspended in that doorway. When I asked calmly, "Were you going to let me choose my own life again?" He blinked. "I'm not asking for the apology you rehearsed in your car," I added. "I'm asking when you decided my life was no longer mine." He looked down. "I didn't mean for it to get that far." But it did. His voice cracked. I didn't know what else to do. I was drowning. "You could have asked me for help," I said. "Like a man, like a son." He sat back on his heels, wiping his face with the sleeve of his shirt. "The company's been bleeding money since the end of 2020, he said, barely audible. "COVID hit us hard. Then 2 contracts fell through. I took out a line of credit. Then another. We owe $280,000. And Monica, she can't find work. We're months behind on the mortgage." He paused, then looked up. "I saw the life insurance policy Dad left you, and I thought, maybe if you went into care if something happened." His voice trailed off. Maria stood in the doorway behind me now, her arms folded, jaw clenched. "You thought about using her death to fix your credit score?" she spat. "You're disgusting." Daniel winced. "You lied to all of us," she continued, stepping forward. "You made me think Grandma didn't want to see me. You made us believe she was slipping. You isolated her so you could get to her money." "It wasn't like that," Daniel mumbled. "It was exactly like that," I said. He didn't argue. He just broke, sobbing there on the porch like the man in him had collapsed under the weight of everything he'd done. I let him cry. And then I spoke clearly, firmly, not cruelly, but with finality. "You will pay back every dollar you owe. You will go to therapy, and you will write a letter of apology to every relative and friend you lied to about me." He looked up, stunned. "Do it," I said, "or don't. But if you don't, I will consider our relationship over. Not out of anger, but because I won't let you near me again." The silence that followed was thick and absolute. He nodded slowly. "I'll do it." he whispered. "I'll start tomorrow." I closed the door gently behind me. Not out of spite, but because it was my door. And I had just remembered it still belonged to me. The ripple effect was faster than I imagined. Within days of the email, the family threads lit up with whispers that turned quickly into truths. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years sent messages of disbelief. Old friends called to say they had no idea how far things had gone. Daniel's carefully crafted image, the dutiful son, the struggling entrepreneur, began to crack. Then the real consequences began. His largest client, a healthcare logistics firm out of Harrisburg, pulled out of their contract. Someone on the board had seen the email. Word had spread. Another investor, an old college friend apparently, requested an audit of Daniel's books. Monica didn't say much. She sent one message I didn't know it had gone that far. And then silence. I never responded. I wasn't sure if she deserved it. Laura, on the other hand, simply vanished. One morning, Maria told me she'd packed her bags and left their house in Philadelphia. No explanation, no forwarding address, and no reply to any of our calls since. Michael flew back for a long weekend and brought Maria with him. We sat on the back patio with blankets and warm cider, the late autumn wind rustling through the trees. "I've been thinking about something," Michael said, leaning forward. "You know how you said you wanted to do more with the second part of your life?" I raised an eyebrow. "Are you implying there's a third?" He smiled. "Only if you want one," Maria chimed in. "We were talking about a nonprofit, something local to California. But we could do something bigger, something national." I sipped my cider. "What kind of nonprofit elder advocacy?" Michael said. "Education? Legal aid? Emergency helplines? We'd call it the Elder Voice Foundation." Maria nodded. "Grandma, you wouldn't just be the inspiration. You'd be the face." I laughed, but not from amusement, from something like disbelief. "I spent half a decade being silenced, and now you want me to speak for everyone?" "Yes," Maria said gently, "because you didn't stay silent." We sat in silence for a while. Birds chirped somewhere in the distance, and I could hear the sound of kids playing a few houses down. Eventually, I stood and walked back into the house. From the closet, I pulled out the folder labeled Real Estate. Inside were the papers for the lake house I rarely used and the old rental in Mount Lebanon. That evening, I called my broker. "I'm ready to sell both," I told him. "I'm moving to California." I didn't tell him why. I didn't explain that it wasn't just about Daniel or the betrayal or the money. It was about momentum. About not letting the worst moment in my life become the most defining. And when I told Michael and Maria over dinner, I watched their faces light up. Not from relief, but from respect. "You sure?" Michael asked. "Very." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I looked out the window at the dark sky above Pittsburgh and knew for the first time in years that I wasn't just closing a chapter. I was writing the next one myself. The late afternoon sun poured golden light across the little cottage porch, warming my knees as I sat in the rocker with a light quilt across my lap. Just beyond the white picket fence, Nolan giggled as he chased a wind-blown leaf through the garden. His joy, so simple and unburdened, filled the air like music. The rosemary bush I'd planted last month had taken to the soil well, and I could smell its sharp scent each time the breeze kicked up. I'd named the place Cedar Bloom. Not for any cedar trees, but because I liked how it sounded. A new beginning deserved a name after all. A knock at the gate made Nolan look up. I turned my head just in time to see Deborah, my neighbor from 3 doors down, lifting a foil-covered plate high in greeting. "Thought you could use something sweet," she called out. "It's just lemon pound cake." I stood and opened the gate. "If it's half as good as your cinnamon muffins last week, I'll need to walk 10 miles after," she laughed, handing me the plate. "Welcome to the street, Evelyn. You're already everyone's favorite." I smiled. Not out of politeness, but because it was true. Here I was, just Evelyn. Not the woman whose son tried to lock her away. Not a cautionary tale. Just a neighbor with a garden and a rocking chair. After she left, I brought the cake inside, cut a slice for Nolan, and watched him devour it with sticky fingers and a content little hum. He reminded me so much of Michael at that age, wide-eyed, hungry for the world, still unafraid to laugh too loud. Later, Maria stopped by after her meeting at the university. She kicked off her sneakers at the door, flopped onto the couch, and grinned. "They loved it," she said. Elder Voice Foundation is officially being included in the ethics curriculum next semester. We'll be giving talks on dignity, consent, and care for seniors. And we've already got 4 volunteers for our legal aid branch. I nodded, proud and quiet. "You're doing something good, sweetheart." "No," she said, looking at me with soft defiance. "You are?" We talked a while longer. About fundraising outreach, a podcast she wanted to start. Then just before she left, she handed me a small envelope. "It came to my place," she said, "from Dad." I held it in my lap long after she'd gone. Eventually I opened it. The handwriting was Daniel's. Still neat, still familiar. He didn't make excuses, he didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply wrote, "I'm still in treatment. Weekly sessions." It's hard. But I've started to understand why I became the person who did what I did. I was afraid, and I made that your problem. I know I have a long way to go, but I'm trying. There was no mention of money, no plea for a second chance. Just, I'm trying. And somehow that mattered. Laura never replied. I had stopped expecting her to. As the sky shifted toward dusk, I stepped back onto the porch and settled in again, watching the light soften over the rooftops. The wind moved gently through the trees. I closed my eyes and breathed it in. At 77, I had lost a son in one way, but I had gained something far greater. I had reclaimed my voice. I had found a family who saw me clearly. And I had become again a version of myself I thought was long buried under years of silence. I am not someone's burden. I am not just someone's mother. I am Evelyn, and this life is mine. If you've ever known someone who was treated unfairly like I was, someone older silenced, pushed aside, don't let it go unseen. Share their story. Speak their name. Help them remember they still matter, because none of us should have to suffer quietly just because we got old.